Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
A little over half of us have had that strange and uncanny experience of lucid dreaming. About 23% of people say that they lucid dream every month. Various mystical practices cultivate lucid dreaming as part of their spiritual practice and even a preparation for the afterlife. 19th century occultists worked tirelessly to escape the body and travel the inner planes at will. And the recently published Dan Brown book, The Secret of Secrets, also explores the uncanny powers of consciousness and the possibility that maybe consciousness extends beyond the physical brain. So, when we find ourselves lucid dreaming, we often will take it as an opportunity to feel omnipotent. We'll want to vault into the air, wresting the power of the dream away from the dream maker and putting it in the hands of the ego may be an uncertain proposition that deserves some careful consideration.
You know, this has been a topic that has been very frequently requested on the podcast. And I think I've felt a little resistance to talking about it because there isn't a big opus of work around lucid dreaming and Jungian dream work. That intersection, it's there, but it's a little sparse. And I know there's a lot of excitement, like you're saying, Joseph, about lucid dreaming, so much online. Whenever I'm looking up something and dreaming on the internet, it's just you can't help but find something about lucid dreaming. A lot of activity about lucid dreaming in places like Reddit and that sort of thing. So this is something that really appeals to a lot of people. But we as Jungians, I think, are generally a little bit suspicious of trying to cultivate a lucid state for the purpose of shaping the dream experience, because it feels like kind of the colonization of the unconscious on the part of consciousness. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. And I think we're going to talk today about lots of different ways that lucidity can enhance our dialogue with the unconscious, let's say.
I think it has a lot to do with preparation. I mean, as I said, it's not uncommon when people say, "Oh, I had a lucid dream last night." And when I'll say, "Well, what did you do?" And most of the people I talk to say, "I jumped up into the air and I was soaring all over the place. It was the most wonderful, euphoric experience." And yet, is that really the best thing I might have done if I had a little window of opportunity to actively and fully engage the content of the unconscious? So part of it is I think people take it a little bit superficially.
Right.
That it's kind of a game.
You know, you made this great point when we were prepping this, is that in a lucid state, you can do anything you want without any consequences.
Right.
There's something about our modern perspective that it's almost like that's what we long for. I think we're aware that we live in a world where whatever we do has consequences. And that's a very painful realization, whether it's that, you know, when we're unkind to our partner, eventually it, you know, erodes the relationship, or the way that we're living is destroying the planet. Everything we do has consequences. How great it would be to live in a world where nothing we did had consequences. And, you know, that's kind of a childlike state in a way. When we're children, we're not aware of the consequences that our actions have. And, you know, it can be a little bit like being in a video game where you can, you know, steal cars and you never worry about having to serve any prison time. or you can murder lots of people and there's no consequence, or you can die and you just respawn. It does have some place, I think, that fantasy realm. But it's interesting that we kind of long for that, and that some people are willing to go through a lot of effort to be able to get to that place in their dreams.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting for people to feel that they can step into a whole other universe where they can make things happen very magically. It's like suddenly you're in a Harry Potter, novel, and you can do all kinds of extraordinary things. Fun, exciting, it's powerful in a certain fashion. But if we think of the dream as a kind of medicine that is very carefully crafted by the dream maker, who I think of as the self, that the dream maker has been watching us, coming to certain conclusions about where we are in our journey, and then carefully crafts the dream to try to nudge us in a particular direction to affect us. Now, in order for the dream to deliver its medicine, the ego also has to be changed. And this is where sometimes listeners will hear us talk about the dream ego. So we have our experience of our waking personality, and then when we fall asleep, the dream maker seems to be able to put certain parts of our ego to sleep. We no longer think discriminatingly, or maybe it'll suspend our disbelief. So that in the dream, you're having coffee and then the rhinoceros comes out in his underwear and starts talking to you. And in the dream ego, it seems perfectly reasonable for that to be happening. So there's a way that our disbelief is suspended, which allows our whole nervous system to engage in the drama of the dream. As soon as that's violated and we realize that we are awake in the dream world, what I suspect is that the dream loses its power, and its power to help us, actually.
I think that there are some people who would disagree with that in some sense, and this is not my personal experience, but I
Yes.
have read accounts of people for whom lucidity created a kind of intensification in terms of the dream's ability to deliver a message. So, but let's talk about that. But just backing up for a second, Aristotle spoke about lucidity in dreams. So we have to recognize that it's something that does happen spontaneously for some number of people. He wrote in his 4th century treatise on dreams, often when one is asleep, there is something in consciousness which declares that what then presents itself is but a dream. So this has certainly been around for a long time. Neuroscientists poo-pooed the idea that there could be lucidity in dreams. But scientists realized that he might be able to use eye movements as a way for the lucid dreamer to signal that he was lucid. And so it was captured in the laboratory. I'm just going to read a little bit from the book, This Is Why You Dream. And that book, by the way, is by Rahul Jandyal, and we'll have that in our book list. And he says, the eye movements produced large, distinct zigzags on a scroll of paper on the electrooculogram. Hearn watched with astonishment. Moments earlier, he'd been half asleep watching the ink tracing scroll past as he'd been up all night monitoring the recording equipment. What he saw on the chart paper jolted him awake, knowing he was witnessing history. He later wrote that he was as excited as if the signals had come from another solar system. That moment officially opened the door to the rigorous scientific exploration of lucid dreaming. The slashing strokes up and down on the scrolling chart paper would become seismic shocks in the neuroscience community. It was the first time someone had signaled in real time while dreaming, proving that in at least one case, in one person, it was possible to be awake inside the dream. So they've subsequently done further research along this line, and of course, I've kind of mapped this territory very well. So, the person is in REM sleep, and there's like another level of consciousness. So it's interesting that scientists are very curious about this process.
Yes, I think this has moved forward now that we have these functional MRIs so that they can do an EEG so they understand what's happening in the brain, and then they can see which parts of the brain light up. So there's, I'm not even going to try to pronounce those things, different parts of your brain start talking to each other. So there's lucid REM sleep and there's non-lucid REM sleep. And as they compare those two things, different parts of the brain are coupling and creating a kind of synergistic process. So it really is a unique brain state. Maybe it's a kind of genetic ability. Maybe it can be learned. Many people do think it can be learned.
Oh, yeah. Have you ever had a lucid dream?
I have. I don't have many of them. And I've spent a lot of time trying to cultivate out-of-body experiences. And so I can, with some regularity, have an out-of-body experience. I consider them fairly similar.
These are waking experiences, the out-of-body experiences.
No, I lose all body awareness. I mean, it really is like I'm in a dream world.
But it's not happening when you're asleep, is what I'm saying.
Well, I'm going from the waking state into this inner world.
Right.
And that transition, one would say, is that falling asleep? It's changing some form of consciousness. To me, it feels like lucid dreaming, in as much as I am in a dreamscape, and the laws of nature are different in that inner place. The question is, that can, for many of us, happen accidentally, where I just have this shift of consciousness in the middle of a dream. But it may be possible, which I think is true, is that we can seek this shift of consciousness, and so we know that we are transitioning and maintaining awareness. And I think one of the signs of, let's say, an out-of-body experience as well as a lucid dream is that I lose all consciousness of my physical location in my physical body, that my whole sensorum is in this inner world, and I have my full cognitive abilities to explore, to ponder. The delicacy of it, and I think this is true with lucid dreaming as well, is that sometimes it's rather exciting to be in these states, and the smallest amount of adrenaline just pops you right out and into a waking state. So it's staying really calm, super controlled, seems to be one key.
So I have had some lucidity in dreams. I find that it's more likely to happen when I'm doing a lot of really intensive dream work. So I'm like really writing down my dreams every night and talking about them in analysis or working with them myself. Then I'm more likely to have a lucid dream. But it has been a long time since that's happened. But when I've been lucid in dreams, it's more like this. I'll be like, oh, I'm dreaming about going to the airport again. I have a lot of dreams about being at the airport. I have to remember to write this down, or I have to remember to bring this to analysis, or I wonder if this is the same airport as in my last dream. So it has that kind of quality to it. It's just like maybe another layer. So it's not, maybe one of the things that we're also lifting up too, or maybe we should be lifting up or distinguishing between is when you become lucid in a dream and when you decide to direct the dream. To me, those are two different things. Perhaps the first kind of precedes the second. So a lot of people who are seeking lucidity, they want to become lucid so that then they can choose to, have sex with a million interesting people or fly, like you said, Joseph, or do something really cool, versus, wow, here I am in this kind of double state. So the dream worker, Melinda Powell, who I've had the pleasure to meet, she's at the Dream Research Institute in London. She's written a really beautiful book called Lucid Surrender. And it's her thesis that sort of the value of lucidity is in the former, that you become aware that you're dreaming, and then you're able to kind of experience and perhaps integrate these different states. That it isn't about, at that point, taking advantage of your lucid state to implement your ego agenda, but it's more about having access to more. And she gives in her book, and again, we'll put this book in our book list. She gives in her book a really quite lovely example of one of her lucid dreams. So I'm going to be just reading a passage from her book for a second. She says, in ordinary waking life, we perceive ourselves to exist in a single reality, bounded by space and time. However, in lucidity, we may find ourselves conscious of multiple dimensions of being, as in the following dream, when I had some years ago into my practice of lucid dreaming, a time when I was also running a counseling center. So here's her dream. I sit in a room where my dream teacher from waking life gives a lecture. Feeling very tired, I fall asleep as I listen, and in my dream sleep, I become lucid. This is a dream within a dream, and she's lucid within that dream. The dreamscape lifts like a veil, and I find myself standing at the edge of a massive hall, the floor covered with a fiery colored Persian prayer rug. Surprisingly, numerous babies crawl around on the rug like little miracles of light. Even as I recognize the infants as representations of the spirit's creative potential, they also remind me of my own longing to have a child. On the opposite side of the hall spins a white light form set against glowing darkness. I am aware that, by means of lucid surrender, I can receive spiritual replenishment from this numinous being of light. As I stand observing the scene before me, I am aware of multiple dimensions at once. Myself asleep on my bed, the lecture room in which the initial dream took place, the dream sleep in which I become lucid, the hall full of babies, and the mystery of the spinning light form in the shining darkness. Becoming aware of these 5 levels at once, I collapse to the floor and wake up. I think she means wake up in her sleep. Surprised to find myself back in the lecture room with others gathered around me. So still a dream. A dream being, mimicking my hand movements, tells me, you were sitting there in a kind of trance, speaking about how all 5 dimensions fit together.
What a great example of being able to wake up in the unconscious and to stay poised and curious and wondering rather than rushing to take action. And so lucid dreaming, I think, is exactly what Jung was talking about with active imagination, when it can happen with a full sensory immersion.
Mm-hmm.
When Jung is describing in the Red Book and the Black Books these very full sensory encounters with these inner figures, boy, it sounds like lucid dreaming, which is activating these several brain centers simultaneously. We know that Jung was working with some yogic techniques. Certain pranayama can induce some of these states. There's also some techniques people, if they're interested, could try out. One of them has been done with some double-blind testing where people sleep for 6 hours and they stay up for 30 to 60 minutes. And then as they're drifting off to sleep, they make this determination that I will have a lucid dream, or I will wake up in my dream. And this little pattern of 6 hours, 60 minutes up, make a determined statement, seems in these laboratory tests to increase the number of lucid dreams that people can have. And again, if they can go in with that level of lovely respect and curiosity, something extraordinary can definitely happen.
I mean, Melinda's story is interesting because she has just surrendered, and she's an observer who's almost better able to take in more, partly because of the lucidity. She can be in these different levels. But I have heard, Joseph, much like you're talking about, people using a lucid experience to deepen engagement with the unconscious. So unfortunately, I can't remember where I read this. I think it was very many years ago, but it really stuck with me. So I'm going to try to sort of repeat it. But someone was having a kind of recurring nightmare of being sort of met by an intruder, let's say, in his apartment, someone breaks in. And it was just this kind of terrifying nightmare. And it was just happening again and again. And Eventually, I can't remember if he worked on becoming lucid in the dream. I think he may have. And so the next time it happened in the dream space, he, instead of responding with his usual defensiveness or running away or attacking the intruder, he said, what do I need to know? He engaged the intruder. He used his lucid state to engage the intruder. And that resulted in an incredibly rich process of dialoguing with this dream figure. And it's something we very much might find in active imagination. We could do that in active imagination, but he did it in the dream, and it resolved the nightmare, and it resulted in a lot of insight. So I could imagine someone becoming lucid and being like, I'm going to make the intruder fall down the stairs, or I'm going to make the intruder into a clown, or something like that, which wouldn't be the same thing as inviting the intruder to come forward and talk. So I think, when we talk about lucidity, in and of itself is not good or bad, let's say, but it's sort of like in service to what?
Hmm.
Are you seeking lucidity or or taking advantage of your lucid state to impose an ego agenda on the dream? Or are you using it to invite more engagement with the unconscious?
Yes, and I think that's moves us, between the sacred and the profane and back and forth. And often, particularly with a lucid dream, we aren't necessarily prepared to have a lucid dream. We kind of surprise ourselves with the realization.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it takes a certain discipline and determination to have the right attitude, a useful attitude to our lucid dreams, to engage the characters, to learn, to wonder what's happening. I think that creates a different environment that's, I think, much more conducive and just as you were reading from the book, much more profound, more healing, perhaps.
And, it's interesting to note that a lot of cultures have been very interested in lucid dreaming. And, particularly what comes up is Tibetan Buddhism. So in Buddhism, there's this important thing that happens, right? When the Buddha sits under the Bo tree and achieves enlightenment. And what he has to do while he's meditating is he faces various demons. He faces the seductions of pleasure and status and all these things that try to lure him away from his meditation. And then he faces these terrible demons who try to frighten him out of his meditation. And his task is to recognize that these are just emanations from his mind and they're not real. They are manifestations of Mara or illusion. And it's by being able to recognize these things as illusory that results in him achieving enlightenment. So in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, I believe there's a belief that what happens after you die is a period of 40 days in which you are in the bardo. So it's this kind of in-between life and death sort of state. And the understanding is that the bardo state is exactly like the dream state. The Plains Indians of North America, for example, believe something very similar. They believed that to die is to walk the path of the dream without returning. So for Tibetan Buddhists and others, the dream state is just like the bardo. So therefore, dreaming is an opportunity to kind of practice what you're going to face in this space between living and dying. The hope is that in that bardo state, you will be able to not be seduced by the pleasures or be frightened by the demons. And then you will be, kind of released into the afterlife. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead is all about learning how to do that. And so there are Tibetan dream practices that are sometimes referred to as dream yoga to cultivate a lucid state so that you can practice disengaging from these strong feelings, frightening images, deliciously wonderful experiences, and recognizing them as illusory. I mean, I think that's that's in part kind of relevant to our more psychological understanding of dreams? It seems like it's related in some way.
Well, I think so. It goes back to this idea of respect. One of the terms that the Buddhists use, which reminds me very much of the book quote you read, is you are able to tell yourself this is a dream and then sustain a non-grasping clarity.
I like that.
So just as we were saying, to not manipulate the dream, but we are bringing more curiosity, more consciousness to whatever is happening there. We might have a bit of audacity in as much as nightmare figures that we might normally run away from. Maybe we run towards, give them a big hug, do something different. But having the right attitude makes all the difference. And fairy tales, by the way, tell us that all the time.
Absolutely.
Come into the uncanny world, you've got the right attitude, things go fairly well. If not, things go less well.
Just what you were saying made me think of something. I mean, a lot of times we see, if we track a kind of a dream series, like you're saying, kind of run towards some terrible thing. If you track a dream series long enough, you'll see something like that, right? There may be this like amorphous, terrifying content, and then in the next dream, a month later, it's no longer amorphous. It has a form, but it's effing terrifying. And then maybe a couple months later, it's like a little bit less terrifying. But it's possible that a kind of the right attitude and a creative use of lucidity, you might be able to speed that up. Because again, like once the terrifying thing has a form, instead of running away, you might say, "Well, wait a minute, I need to turn toward it and say, hey, how you doing?" and that might speed up a kind of psychological process. So I think it can be used in service to, a greater connection with the unconscious, which is, in a sense, is the point of dream work. And I would say also the point of a Jungian analysis is to forge that very strong kind of communication channel between consciousness and the self or the dream maker.
Yeah, I think with some coaching, particularly, let's say, in the Tibetan tradition, people can go in with this intent to investigate the nature of one's mind. But that would be something that's a little more coached, a little more curated, a little more specific than kind of mucking around the way most of us did when we were kids, discovering we were awake in our dreams.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the purpose of the Tibetan dream yoga, to sort of disconnect from it, from a Western perspective, it sort of feels like they're saying, privilege the ego, but I don't think it's quite the same thing. I think this is where Eastern philosophy, it translated into Western language, loses something. It is to sort of disconnect from it in a way that feels, in essence, a little bit similar to what we were talking about when someone, say, is going to turn around and face the giant snake, let's say, that you recognize its autonomy, perhaps,
Mhm.
and you don't diminish it. I liked what you said about a sort of an ungrasping, or when you talked before about how the adrenaline can sort of pop you out of it. You cultivate a real observing stance. That seems to me to be the thing that's the same. That you're able to somewhat dispassionately observe it. Feels like a common thread there.
One of the other benefits people report from lucid dreaming is their ability to retain this kind of very vivid and meticulous detail. That the more consciousness the ego has in the dream, the more likely you're going to carry back a more accurate memory of the encounter, because more of consciousness is present during it.
Yeah, and actually, I'm always interested in learning more about dream recall because so many people on the podcast ask about that. So I'm always like looking for new techniques, and it's often that when I'm engaged in those searches that I find information about lucidity, and some of the things that encourage lucidity also encourage more vivid dream recall. So there is some overlap there. So I think you're right about that, Joseph. A lot of the things that you might do to encourage lucidity might also help you retain dreams more vividly. So one of the things that's interesting about this is that as far as we can tell, Jung never mentioned lucid dreaming.
I found that really interesting too, as I was kind of searching through the collected works. And von Franz also, uh, who in some ways is a bit more of a mystic, she also doesn't mention it. So I wish they had. I would love to know how they worked with that material or what they made of it. But I do find it strange that either they were having them, but they discarded them as perhaps not useful to the process, or whether this is, I don't know, just a very unusual process to have a lucid dream, and it maybe is more rare than we realize.
Or was it that because they were attending so carefully to their dreams and so engaged in active imagination, that material came out in these different ways?
Well, Jung certainly said that. I don't know which of the biographies, but towards the end of his life, he was quoted as saying that he just no longer dreamed.
Yeah.
And he felt that that was because he was talking to the unconscious all day long, so there wasn't much for the unconscious to say back to him in the dream state.
And, von Franz, I was lucky enough to get to see the inside of von Franz's tower a number of years ago. Von Franz had an active imagination room. It was this little room that had this incredible mural in it. And that's where she would go to engage in active imagination. So I think it was so much a part of her life to engage with the unconscious like that. I think active imagination is a really good parallel to a lucid dream, the way we've been discussing it. It's kind of, it's an invitation to have a more intentional conversation with the unconscious. And so it may be that they were just doing so much of that they didn't lucid dream. Because I do think that if you're attending so much to your dream life, it's likely that you'll have some degree of lucidity. And I will say that in my practice, people who focus a lot on their dreams and also people who do a lot of meditation are more likely to report some lucidity. I don't have a lot of people who lucid dream, and I don't think I've ever had an analysian come in and really talk about that experience of like, yeah, I was lucid dreaming, so I jumped off a building to see what would happen, Yeah, it's almost like that's a different goal.
So what I was thinking as you were talking is how in a number of mystical traditions, you will find this idea that the adept becomes sleepless. So, for instance, in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, who is the perfect warrior, also never slept, that he had an eternal wakefulness. A number of other mystics talk about this eternal wakefulness, and what they mean is that the body will fall asleep, but the ego will remain awake and interactive in these various inner worlds, and then return to body consciousness afterwards. And that is thought of as a kind of attainment. And that seems to be related to changes in the pineal gland in those systems. If we remember that the pineal gland is responsible for producing melatonin, which is the primary hormone that puts us into a sleep state, one would think that changes in the pineal gland could create alterations in our sleep states.
So one of the things that makes me think of, Joseph, goes back to the science of lucid dreaming, which I have a very tenuous grasp of. But
Me too.
But they found that there is a different gamma brainwave frequency that's associated with lucid dreaming, and it's associated with meditation in contrast to just regular REM sleep. I guess it's 40 hertz. And this higher range of 40 hertz is actually more pronounced when the lucid dreamer is not trying to control the dream. So, like, there is something very special about that state. I guess the implication is it's somewhat similar to meditation, but that it's even more when the ego is not grasping, to go back to what you said before.
Yeah, I think the seduction of power
Yeah.
can contaminate probably every human experience, but certainly is corrosive when we're engaging the unconscious. It doesn't particularly appreciate being bullied and tends to actually produce a paradoxical response.
And do you have a sense of, look, I know that Jungians in general, we're a little bit distrustful of lucid dreaming for the reasons that I think are probably obvious. But when you say it can kind of bring about these negative results, do you have any sense of what might happen if we're, constantly wresting control of our dreams and using this, I would say, kind of sacred capacity to be in relationship with the unconscious for ego purposes? Do you have thought about that?
My concern is that it can lead to a really serious inflation,
Mm.
that to have that experience of being kind of godlike, flying and doing whatever you want, or maybe assaulting people or trying to seduce every inner figure you can find, it can give the ego this sense of omnipotence and lack of boundaries. And because it's a full sensory experience, we can trick part of our nervous system into thinking we've done that and normalizing it, thinking that, oh, well, this might be okay. And there are certain impulses in our psyche that we need to observe from a distance until we attain enough muscularity to really stand face to face to it. So being in a lucid dream and acting out really with a lot of primality can put us in the way of very powerful forces that aren't so easy to put back in the bottle once you've uncorked it.
I'm aware that we have colonized so much of the natural world. It's difficult to find a space of the Earth's surface that hasn't been touched in some profound way by humans, that's just untouched nature. And in some sense, our dreams are that little bit of untouched nature that hasn't been kind of paved over by consciousness or had a parking lot erected.
Right, or optimized for the ego agenda of some kind.
Yeah. And dreams are kind of endangered in a sense. They're endangered by our alarm clocks. They're endangered by the fact that we don't get as much sleep as we should. They're endangered by the fact that we maybe don't value our dreams as much as we should. The Jungian analyst Anthony Stevens says this: as we wander ever further into the materialist desert that our civilization has become, our dreams are the only oases of spiritual vitality left to us. They represent our primordial habitat, our last wilderness, and we must protect them with as much fervor as the rainforests, the ozone layer, the elephant, and the whale. So I think that that's a little bit of a cautionary note to sound that we want our dreams to remain that bit of kind of protected wilderness within.
That's a beautiful quote, that we need the irrational.
Mm-hmm.
And when the ego comes in and takes control, even if it's benevolent control, we're putting or installing a structure that makes sense to us. But much of the magic and the medicine of the unconscious doesn't really make sense. It defies logic. It's strange and uncanny. And yet, when we swim into it and then come back upon waking, we are refreshed, not just in body, but we're refreshed at the level of soul. We've come to some place that I think there is a way that lucid dreaming can be in service to individuation if the right attitude, the non-grasping attitude, could be cultivated and carried into the dream state. There are a number of techniques that are easily accessible to toy with this, and now even technology. The Monroe Institute does interesting stuff with this using sound technology.
Hmm.
I think that it could be a useful tool. And some of you who just naturally lucid dream several times a week, I mean, you're pioneers. You're trying to figure out how to live in that world, how to make it work for you. And hopefully you've come to discover that it too is sacred space.
Yes, that's really well put. And if you'd like to learn more about working with your dreams, remember that we have Dream School. It's our 12-month online self-paced program. You get to hang out with us every month. Each of us has a live program that we offer. It's a really great community of people. Our Dream School students join dream groups if they like, and those are very rich, wonderful experiences that connect people across the world who are interested in dreams. So take a look. You can head over to our website, thisjungianlife.com, and you'll see more information there about Dream School. And maybe now is the time to switch to a dream.
Today's dreamer is a 42-year-old male who works as a lawyer for a conservation nonprofit that deals with water issues. And the title of his dream is The Elk in the Castle. And here is his dream. I'm wandering through the endless stone halls of a dark and abandoned cathedral-like castle. Tall gray walls, faded red tapestries, and endless halls. I feel aimless and searching. In one shadowed corridor, I find a massive animal, perhaps a deer or elk, or some ancient ancestor. It's exhausted, frightened, and out of place, clearly more lost than me. Through an intuitive telepathic connection, I assure it that I mean no harm and can help it find a way out. I'm not surprised it understands or trusts me. As we walk together, I realize I don't know the way out, yet I feel an overwhelming duty to guide and help. If not me, who? Eventually, we find a breach in the castle wall. Outside is not a forest, but a vast, empty sky looking down a cliff. Extending from the castle is a narrow ridgeline path steeply descending into clouds below. It looks dangerous, but I'm convinced it's the only way to free the elk. Using the same communication, I convince it to try the path. The elk hesitates, then steps forward, looking back for reassurance. After only a few steps out, it slips and falls 50 feet to a ledge below, alive but mortally injured and in agonizing pain. I stand at the edge and watch helplessly, overcome with grief, horror, and shame for having caused the pain and eventual death of this great animal. I also feel immensely guilty for trying to help, but ultimately making things worse. At the same time, also feeling a strange relief that the unbearable burden of this responsibility has lifted. I'm somehow free again to continue wandering aimlessly in the castle halls without responsibility. The dream ends. For context, he writes, I thought about this a lot, and there was nothing of note in my waking life, such as life transitions. I have a pretty great job in a meaningful community and integrated life. I do note that generally I am unable to remember dreams, often going months without being able to remember fragments or echoes of dreams. But this dream was one I awoke from and remembered very vivid details and the story arc. Even months later, I remember details and feelings very well. As for feelings in the dream, he writes, at first, the main feeling was aimlessness. Then with the elk, there was a sense of duty and purpose and fulfillment from being able to help another being. As we continued to be lost, the feeling turned to that of being burdened and uncertainty, but also wanting to keep up appearances because I had convinced the animal to rely on me for its safety. After the elk fell, I felt horror, guilt, and helplessness at what I had done. But I also felt a sense of relief because the burden I had taken on was now out of my hands and I could go back to being aimless in the castle and not tied to that sense of duty. For associations, he adds, the castle is old and feels almost from an ancient civilization, and I don't know how or why I'm there. The elk seems majestic, but also pitiful given its circumstances. I feel called to help it.
Well, this obviously feels like a big dream. Feels like a big dream, and I can immediately, it's kind of a devastating dream, and I can immediately generate a lot of fantasies about what it might mean in a person's life. But it's also one of those dreams that feels like it could have a kind of collective significance as well.
What are you imagining that way?
Well, in terms of collective significance, one of the most striking things is that he sort of enjoys, well, there's a slight, I'm going to say there's a sense that he enjoys wandering aimlessly without the burden of responsibility. And there's this great tragedy that happens that this majestic animal is suffering and will die. But there's a part of him that feels really bad about that. But there's a part that's like just wants to go back and aimlessly wander through the castle. And when I think about environmental degradation, and he does work for an environmental organization, I can relate to that because in a way, there's a kind of a massive die-off of species going on. And I personally can hook into that and feel just an overwhelming sadness about it. And then most of the time I just disconnect from that awareness and I go about, checking out Instagram or watching the latest show on Netflix or just kind of wandering aimlessly and forgetting about my responsibility because it's just almost too overwhelming. So I wonder about that. It's sort of like, what is that great ancient elk? What could that represent? And where does it need to be? And I'm asking this in the most general way. Is it something that needs to die? He mentions it might be an ancient ancestor. And there were these kind of, there was this period in evolutionary history when there was like these massive mammals, and there was a sort of like super big version of kind of an elk. I can't remember what it's called, but I think there's one at the Natural History Museum in New York. I could probably poke around and find its name, but it's like, it's huge. Elk are huge, moose are huge, but these were really huge. But those animals are extinct, so is this something really ancient, but it's kind of run its course? Or is it kind of the last of its kind? I don't know. My imagination is just kind of going different ways with it. An Indrakathir. I can't believe I just thought of that. An Indrakathir.
Oh my gosh. Yes, there is something mythic about this, supernaturally enormous elk. And we might investigate some of the particulars about what makes elks unique among similar animals like deer or moose. And then we might be able to translate that into a kind of metaphor. I found myself emotionally responding to the dream ego's certainty
Yes.
that all is safe, and then beckoning the creature, the animal, forward, kind of shushing it, reassuring it, and then having something horrendous happening. The amount of guilt that I know I would feel for doing that would just be just crushing. But if I think of the dream being like a fairy tale, generally speaking, the animals know more than the ego.
Yeah, that's great. I like that.
So there's an inversion here where the ego is telling the instincts what's real, what it should do. It's looking back kind of worried. And I think the meta-communication is the ego really can't and shouldn't tell the instincts, what's right and what's wrong or what reality is, because the instincts know things that the ego just can't know.
Yeah, that feels just right. Because what I'm aware of is that I mean, first of all, just the emotion of this dream really moved me. But I'm aware that it ends. If we look at the lysis of the dream, if we look at the resolution, he goes back to just wandering aimlessly in the castle. So I'm just going to go back and find that last sentence. He says, I'm somehow free again to continue wandering aimlessly in the castle without responsibility. So that's kind of a regressive movement. We're always interested in kind of, if we look at the arc of the dream, what's true at the beginning, what's true at the end. And, hopefully if it's sort of a good progressive story, something has changed. And really there's, in the beginning, he's wandering aimlessly in the castle. At the end, he's wandering aimlessly in the castle. And you don't get the feeling he's going to find his way out because he's not even really that bothered by it.
Right.
So I wonder in what way he might be wandering aimlessly through the castle of life. I'm very aware that this is sort of a midlife moment. He's not bringing up any midlife issues, but it sure sounds like something might be cooking on the inside. But I think you're right, Joseph. There is this sort of inversion that, when I first read it, I thought, oh, it's really good that he feels this sense of responsibility to the elk. That felt really positive to me. But then there is this kind of certainty that comes in. I want to go back and find that language.
That there's an elk there, and the dream ego says, I feel an overwhelming duty to guide and help.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe the elk was going to be your guide, that the elk was there to give you help because you're wandering endlessly in these dark holes.
And it says it looks dangerous, but I'm convinced it's the only way to freedom for the elk. And so, again, it's like the ego sort of deciding it. And so, like another way the stream might go is I find this elk and it's scared and everything, and I don't know how to help it escape. We're just sort of there together feeling lost, and I'm trying to comfort it or something like that. More just like allowing the ego to not know.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that once he escapes from the castle, which I'm reading along, I'm going, oh my God, they found a way out of the castle. But then there's not a forest. There's sort of there's a cliff. There's under a vast empty sky. So there's a sense of God, it's sort of the spiritual. Again, this is where it feels kind of collective, is because we no longer have the defining grand narrative, let's say, of the Christian, mythopoetic worldview. What we find when we stop aimlessly wandering through the castle of our minds often feels like we're under that open sky and there's just a cliff. Like, where is there to go in terms of understanding our place in the cosmos or what any of this means? It's a real moment of psycho-spiritual confrontation and perhaps even terror for some of us, although I don't hear that that's in the dream. But what we find instead is a kind of certainty. It might be an over-reliance on a rational perspective. Well, this seems like the way to safety. It's and the elk is not so sure.
The elk it's like a child almost, looking back for reassurance. So the tricky thing here for me is that I'm convinced it's the only way to freedom for the elk. That the ego gets this very determined attitude that is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a real confrontation here that if this were my dream, I would call into question some of the things that I'm convinced about.
That's interesting.
And for my own sense of freedom, where am I so sure that this is the path to freedom for me? Could be financial freedom, could be some other kind of freedom. But for no reason that is clear in the dream. It looks dangerous, but I'm convinced it's the only way. Well, it's not as if he's looked for a bunch of other ways. It's that the ego has decided that the elk needs to be somewhere else. We don't have any sense that the elk's looking to run off or even to leave the castle for that matter.
Well, it does seem like the elk is lost, more lost than he is, but he may be more lost than he thinks he is in life, because he says, everything's fine, everything's great, but something in the unconscious is not okay. And it's also it seems like, and maybe this just needs clarification, but that he's the elk is down there suffering, and he's like, I'm going to go back to the castle and wander around. So it seems like there's a moving away from suffering.
The sequencing of the language can make the dreamer sound somewhat cavalier.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if any of us have been in the misfortune of clipping an animal on a highway and you're zooming past and now there's some poor animal on the side of the road, how many of us can slam on the brakes, pull over, do something about the injured animal? It's very challenging depending on where you live. So he's not going to jump down the 50 feet. He doesn't have a gun to put it out of its misery. So there's that mix of guilt and freedom that fate, so to speak, has taken out of his hands. But is it fate?
Mm-hmm.
Is it fate, or has he orchestrated the demise of this frightened beast inside of him? Because he's walking aimlessly around the castle. He encounters an image of affect. He finds this image of exhaustion and fear and lostness. And then once that is dispatched, then he can kind of happily go back to wandering the castle because he doesn't feel exhausted, frightened, or out of place, or even lost. Because that's been, at the very least, pushed over the cliff so that it's somewhere else, away from the ego, so I can come back and not have to feel that.
Yeah, I that feels right. I'm curious if the dreamer has a way of, like you said, kind of pushing off the cliff this relationship with himself in some ways.
So the wandering, the exhaustion, the fear, the out of placeness, the lostness, all needs to come together, not be broken apart.
Yeah, it reminds me of that that part from the Red Book, right in the beginning, when Jung says, "My soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak, I call you. Are you there? I have returned. I am here again. I have shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I have come to you. I am with you. After long years of wandering, I have come to you again." And so, it's a little bit the same. Like there's something ancient there that's been left and forgotten, that now there's the possibility of reconnecting with, but somehow it doesn't go well. Yeah, it feels like a very big dream. I'm reluctant to sort of come down too hard on any one particular understanding of it, because I think there's a lot there, and I can understand. It's understandable that the dreamer has been sitting with it and thinking about it, and it feels really hopeful to me that the dreamer's taking it seriously.
Yes. I think that he could think of this ancient deer or elk as an image of his soul. And then there's that, famous biblical passage, like as the hart desireth the water brooks, so longeth my soul after thee. And the word HART is an old word for a deer. So his soul is wandering with him in this dark castle cathedral. He comes across it. There is a sense that he does have a duty to take care of his own soul, if not me, who? But then he does dispatch it, unfortunately, and assumes that, it should be somewhere else away from him. So there's something just tragic. It's a very tragic dream.
It's also interesting that it's a cathedral-like castle, because if we think about castles are old, cathedrals are old, and they're also having to do with religion. So some kind of old, musty ideas in the culture, maybe about religion, that are interesting. I'm not like, perhaps that the elk doesn't need to leave. I mean, it says it's out of place, and I get that, but I wonder, is it, or is an old kind of cathedral castle? Could our inner cathedral/castle be a living place rather than simply kind of a musty old museum?
And that the task is that the elk is supposed to connect with the dream ego, like mission accomplished. Like that's the task, and then you and the elk go on your adventures together. But the ego makes this decision that he's got to kind of get that elk out there in the natural world when perhaps it really belongs next to you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if it were me, I'd want to do an active imagination with this.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.